Welcome, everybody, to Push Back Idaho's final webinar in our Speakers and Issues series for 2022. Tonight, we're pleased to present Conrad Woodall. He's a retired police officer and a college professor. He's also the director of Idaho's Group for Parents' Rights in Education. This is a national coalition of state chapters which advocates for parents who have children in public schools. They state there are 5 Supreme Court decisions clarifying that parents have the right to direct the education of their children. They work to educate and empower parents that this is, in fact, the case. Conrad will share more at the end of his presentation about this organization and how to contact him. Conrad also holds a master's in forensic psychology and a bachelor's in philosophy. His grad school thesis investigated the realistic self-defense training for survivors of sexual assault, sex trafficking, and intimate partner violence. Add to this 25 years of field experience. So why is Pushback Idaho presenting this topic tonight? We've been active in a variety of education pursuits, starting in Blaine County and moving throughout the state to discover why scores are so low and how to assist in combating the learning loss. As we've kicked over stones, we've seen that it wasn't just COVID that contributed to our kids' downward spiral. I'd like to introduce Jill Williams, a foot soldier in the fight against learning loss, poor scores, and what we've all discovered to be a much more subversive force in our kids' education. Jill, tell them what you've been up to.
Thank you, Pam. I recently moved here from California, and I've been surprised to hear that Idaho is having some of the same issues as California, which have contributed to a decline in school scores. A friend mentioned that her 6th grade nephew was being taught pansexualism, and I had to look this up. It is not limiting sexual choices with regard to biological sex, gender, or gender identity. And her 1st grade daughter has a social emotional learning class, which is replacing a class that would have otherwise been taught. I would hate to see Idaho follow in the same footsteps as California, where so many parents are feeling that the curriculum is inappropriate and are now homeschooling their children. So when I was asked to join a group to help determine the issue of inappropriate books in local and school libraries, I was happy to help. A reading specialist helped us verify that a number of books that many would consider pornographic are in the Alturas and Wood River High School libraries. In the local public libraries, we found that many of these books are also available. The library's main objective is accessibility to books, and there is little concern for being age appropriate. We found a questionable book called It's Perfectly Normal available at a child's eye level in the children's section of the community library. Even if books are located in an adult section, children can access them without an issue. A 12-year-old girl was able to check out Genderqueer, a very sexually explicit book, in an Idaho library that was located in the adult section with the help of a librarian. The president-elect of the American Library Association, Emily Drabinski, is a self-avowed Marxist whose intention is to queer the American library and to make sexually explicit books even more widely available. While the intention of the Idaho legislature is to restrain the distribution, promotion, or dissemination of obscene material, a loophole law exists in Idaho that allows for libraries to make it available. Our group has been raising awareness in our community to let them know about this issue. An article was written in Wood River Weekly called Truth or Dare to highlight the loss of innocence that our children are facing. We are so pleased to have Conrad Woodall here to discuss the harm our children are subject to when they are exposed to highly sexually explicit material at young ages. Thank you for letting me share my experiences.
Thank you, Jill. All right, as we go through Conrad's presentation, we hope you'll all have questions, so please use your question and answer functionality. Nia Benedict is managing questions and answers tonight, and you'll meet her after Conrad speaks. Conrad, over to you.
Thank you, Pam. And I just want to say thank you to Pushback Idaho for creating this dialogue and putting all this together. So before I start and I share my screen and add my presentation, I'm just going to tell 2 quick stories in history to kind of set a stage. In 1846, there was a doctor named Ignaz Semmelweis, and he was a pioneer, but he ended up being laughed out of his profession. And he was the one that basically came up with the idea that doctors were killing women with childbed fever. In other words, he's the one that said, hey, you got to wash your hands. And the entire medical field was against him, even though he proved on his own floor that this worked. He ended up being fired and actually ended up in a mental institution, only to die before realizing that he was right. So the moral of that story is you have this entire profession full of doctors and people, and you have this one pioneer who was actually correct. And another opposite example, we have one doctor or a handful of doctors, one of which was given the Nobel Peace Prize for creating the lobotomy. 50,000 lobotomies were done in the United States before we realized that it was a totally bogus surgery. So in that case, you had a couple of small pioneers that pushed the majority of doctors to take on this whole idea that ended up being false. And the reason why I'm mentioning these two stories is because we're in a very divided country. And one of the problems whenever we come up with ideas, and today we're going to talk about sexuality and gender and bringing it down to kindergarten and what might be the unintended consequences. In both of these stories, there were unintended consequences, okay? And part of the reason why we have some of the issues going on is that we're not debating anymore. We're not talking to each other. And so the purpose of this is to basically just open a dialogue and to talk about these issues, because it's actually in sharing diverse points and talking to each other that we come to figure out these unintended consequences, okay? So I just wanted to share those two stories before I start, because this is another example of something that is complex. Sexuality, gender identity, it's a complex topic. And in order to really wrap our heads around this, we really need to just have good, honest, open dialogue. So I'm going to go ahead and start my presentation now. As soon as I figure this out. Is it up?
You're good to go.
Okay. So the first thing we're going to do is we're just going to cover a couple of topics. So what is age appropriate, right? When it comes to sexuality and gender, how does developmental psychology establish age appropriateness? What is grooming? And grooming right now, when it comes to this topic, often gets talked about in terms of political grooming. I'm going to talk about it in a totally different context and light, which is connected to this idea of unintended consequences. What I mean by political grooming is it tends to be, well, education, this is a leftist type of education that's being pushed down, and it's indoctrination, and therefore it's political grooming or political ideology. And whether that's true or not is really a whole nother debate. I'm going to talk about the unintended consequences related to child molestation as we go further down. And so then the last question is, are schools doing a good job of vetting employees? And I have this picture up, you know, Christmas Story, we're getting ready to come into the holidays. This is an iconic movie in our culture. Everybody's seen it. And one of the main themes of that movie is age appropriateness, right? At what age is a child able to own a BB gun? So this idea of age appropriateness is something that we tackle. When it comes to drinking age, you know, we changed the drinking age. Back in '84, there was a federal act because too many kids were killing themselves. So we pushed the drinking age to 21. We have age for voting. We have age for when you can enter the military. The whole idea of age appropriateness is completely tied to child development. So let's start looking at psychology. Now, when I taught Intro to Psych, this would be a slide that would be in one of your first classes. And this was basically just to tell you, you know, what are the goals of psychology? So we're just going to create kind of a foundation to make sure everybody on the webinar has at least some foundation to start this discourse. And hopefully, you know, we'll all learn something from the questions that are developed in the information here. So the goals of psychology as a field are to understand behavior, to predict behavior, to control behavior. And one of the main methods that we use for that is what's called the biopsychosocial model of psychology. And that's where we look at any given situation and we look at it in terms of what are the biological factors, what are the psychological factors, and what are the sociological factors for causation. And in any given case, one of those might be a greater influence on causation for that particular child or that particular person than another. So we're going to take this just bedrock foundation of psychology, and we're going to start to explore this issue of age appropriateness for sexuality and gender identity. And then we're going to make some predictions about what might result from bringing this material down. In forensic psychology, we make a lot of predictions. That's, shows that have been made famous, like Criminal Minds, things like that. We make a lot of predictions when it comes to whether somebody's gonna commit a crime or not. So to start this off, I'm going to get personal. You're looking at pictures of my son and my daughter there. My son at 10 weeks old was the youngest patient diagnosed with retinoblastoma, which is a rare cancer, to be given chemotherapy treatment at UCSF. I don't know if anybody's, beaten that now, but at that time, he was the youngest patient to start chemotherapy. He went through 4 years of extensive cancer treatment. At one point, we had to move all the way to Houston, Texas to get specialized treatment. That was Monday through Friday for 23 weeks. And, we had to think about what this was going to do, not only physically, but what it was going to do psychologically. So one of the goals of psychology is to control behavior, right? And as parents, my wife and I were really concerned about my son developing depression. Depression, when children, there's studies, longitudinal studies following kids for 20-year studies showing that children that grow up in environments with depression are 3 times more likely to end up being depressed. So we were really concerned about his mental welfare as well as his physical welfare. So the question becomes, well, how do you keep a child happy when they're going through something as horrific as cancer? So the video you're about to see is my wife giving my son a Neupogen injection, which he had to have repeatedly after chemo. That's to keep his white blood cell count up. The kid was getting stuck, sometimes as much as 50 times a month with needles. And if you've ever been to a pediatrician's office and seen a child get jabbed with a needle, it's kind of a traumatic environment. Well, I want you to watch his response.
Be a strong boy, relax. Be a strong boy.
Good
Yeah.
job, buddy.
Relax, mommy's not done yet.
Hey, good job.
Look at that. You did your shot.
Say yay. Yay. Good job.
Okay, so, this is hard to do, to get a child to have that type of reaction, right? This is what we call emotional regulation in psychology. To the left of the screen, you see a picture of my daughter. One of the other things we had to do is we had to really concentrate on our daughter and make sure that we weren't neglecting her when we were having to deal with our child. So we had to really make a conscious effort to keep her happy. My wife and I had to focus on our own psychology because we couldn't allow depression to really sink in with us. Otherwise, it would have, trickled down to the kids. I'm going to show you one more video. And these, again, are pictures. This is the first 4 years of my son's life, just in a cancer hospital. This is where we played. That's my daughter sitting there with him. And he's getting ready to talk about going in to get his chemo injection, his chemo transfusion. You see the picture to the left, he's actually getting a blood transfusion there. And he's going to talk about, throwing up and how excited he is to go to the doctor.
Where do you want to go?
I want to go to the doctor to have the beds, and I put that thing in my chest, and then lay on a pose, and you kind of pull up, and then you pull up.
Why do you want to go to that place?
Yeah, I like it because I want to bring movies and.
Oh, okay.
So, again, this is not the typical cancer patient response for children. This is something that we created using psychology. And, my wife and I, when we were in the cancer ward, you would see the other parents coming in with toddlers, my son's age, and they were crying and they were hanging on to the doors, and the parents would literally pull some of these kids with their grip off the door to bring them in. And it was just, I felt bad, but those parents just didn't quite have the tools to understand how to flip the environment. So one of the things we did is we found out, as an example of how we did this, we found out what were our son's favorite movies and what were his favorite toys. And we made those things that were only done in the hospital. So he was looking forward to this experience of going to the hospital, and we were doing that to try to counteract this horrific experience of cancer treatment. He ended up, in the picture before, you see he's wearing the patch there. He ended up losing his left eye to the cancer treatment. So when he was getting stuck with that needle, he had just had his eye surgically removed. This kid had been through a lot of treatment and trauma, and yet look at his attitude, right? And so the point of that is that's the power of psychology when done correctly. So over to the left, we see the power of psychology and how useful it can be. You know, there we see a happy kid hooked up to all this stuff going through horrific treatment. We see, you know, the bravery and courage of our troops, of our military. That's psychology. Fear, you know, being able to respond courageously is not the absence of fear. It's that you're able to actually function under fear. That's psychology. Without our military being trained that way and our first responders, we wouldn't have these people that run into the buildings when everybody runs out. What you need to understand, though, is that same power can be used for evil. So to the right, we have pictures. One is Philip Garrido, who was the kidnapper of J.C. Dugard. J.C. Dugard stayed kidnapped for 18 years, even when she had the ability to leave on her own due to what's called Stockholm Syndrome, where the victim starts to identify with the perpetrator. Below that, you have Jim Jones, who convinced nearly 1,000 people to drink cyanide-laced Kool-Aid, including mothers, pouring it down the throats of their own children. And then below that, you have Dr. Earl Bradley, one of the most prolific child molesters that we've seen in our country, who molested children down to the age of 3 months old in his pediatrician's practice. This is all the evil of psychology, the same power that can kind of control or manipulate behavior. It can be used for good or it can be used for evil. And that's one of the problems that I have right now with the school system and a lot of what they're doing in terms of whether it's sexuality or gender, or whether which are all fields that kind of stemmed out of psychology and sociology, or whether it's social emotional learning, where they're starting to talk about teachers doing emotional regulation and things like that in the classroom. You know, the reality is most teachers, they just do not have the knowledge or expertise to be trying to manage and control behavior that way. What you just saw with my son, that's emotional regulation. That is teaching somebody to regulate their feelings and their behaviors, even under extreme consequences, much more than what you typically have in a classroom. Asking teachers to do this who have just maybe gone to some little one-day training or some seminar is really way beyond their field of expertise. So let's look at now a foundation for cognitive development. So now we've kind of looked at controlling behavior and how psychology can control behavior. Let's look at understanding a little bit about behavior. What is the cognitive capabilities of your average 5-year-old? So we'll talk about it, watch this film, and then we'll talk about it.
Hi,
Hi,
what's your name?
Daniel.
And how old are you?
5.
Okay. Could you answer some questions for me? Okay. And don't worry, no matter what you say, your answer is going to be fine, okay?
Okay.
Okay. Now, you're looking at those 2 bottles with water in them, right? Okay. And do they have different amounts of water, or do they have the same amount of water?
The same.
Okay. Now, I'm going to do something. Okay. I am going to pour the water from this one into this bottle. Okay. Now, do they have the same amount of water or different?
Different.
Okay, which one has more? Good job, honey. Thank you very much for your help.
Okay, so what you just saw is one of Piaget's famous conservation experiments. And if you don't know who Piaget is, that's okay. But just understand that if you go on the American Psychological Association and you look up the 100 most influential psychologists of the 20th century, Piaget is listed as number 2. Okay. His work, along with Erickson, was really the basis and foundation for what what a lot of our child development theory is now, and how a lot of our education and curriculum was constructed based on age appropriateness and age development. So what you're seeing is one of his conservation, this is a conservation of liquid experiments. And what he's basically demonstrating is that children actually under the age of 7 lack the ability to understand abstract concepts. So this was an idea of volume, right? So when the child is looking at the two glasses that are the same, the two smaller glasses, the child can understand things like that's the same. If they see, you know, I have 3 jelly beans, you have 3 jelly beans, they understand the same. Okay, but if you simply pour that into a tall, skinny jar, which you and I know that that liquid hasn't changed, it is only higher due to the fact of how the volume is represented by the different jars, right? We understand that that's the same. A 5-year-old can't understand that concept because it's abstract. Now, the reason why this is important to understand is because when you talk about gender identity, and you talk about the fact that a child can decide what their gender is absent their biological sex. In other words, children, when they're at a very young age, if you've had toddlers, for instance, when my daughter was 4 and she was starting to help and see my son get his diapers changed and she saw his penis, she would be like, what's that? You know, pointing at it because she didn't understand. She doesn't have that. So what is it? And again, this basic idea, concrete of the same or different, children can understand. So that's one of their first introductions into sexuality, is the fact that, no, your brother's a boy, he has a penis, you're a girl, you have a vagina, it's different, right? It's not the same. And they understand that. Okay, when you try to basically say that you can decide what your gender is, regardless of what your biology is, that is a very abstract concept. The idea that a 5-year-old or a 6-year-old or a 7-year-old can understand that is actually a violation of Piaget. And to argue that, you're really not arguing me, you're arguing Piaget, you're arguing these experiments right here. And one of the solutions to that, you know, that gets brought up, which we'll talk about a little bit later, is, well, we can talk them through that. And I'll discuss a little later why that's flawed. Piaget has several experiments like this. I encourage you to Google them and look them up. You can watch and see children do these different experiments, and they're really fascinating, and it'll give you a good insight of what the cognitive level of a 5-year-old is. So what's happening in psychology, this is my son, and he hates the fact that I put these pictures up on this presentation, but what is the explanation for the idea that children are expressing gender at these young ages? You know, it's my opinion that this is being misconstrued. So what we used to call monkey see, monkey do, okay, in layman's terms, is observational learning, modeling, gender neutral play. So in my house, you know, my daughter's 4 years older than my son. And so one night he came out after my daughter was dressing him all up and parading him through the house because she thought it was more fun to dress him up than her dolls or herself. And he was having a blast. And, you know, this is just fun, gender neutral play. My son didn't have any identity here. He wasn't thinking of himself as a male and he wasn't thinking of himself as a female. He was just playing with his older sister. And that's an expression of modeling and observational learning. The idea that children are fairly gender fluid when they're young is true. They are. They'll engage in this type of play without any real thought about what gender they're expressing. And so one of the arguments becomes, well, if they're gender neutral, right, we shouldn't push gender. And that tends to come from the same people that then say, well, if they're expressing some type of transgender feeling, if they're expressing some type of gender dysphoria, we should actually push the transition. So that's a problematic argument. In other words, if you're saying that kids are gender neutral and we shouldn't push a gender, male or female, well, then we shouldn't push transgender either. We should just let them grow up and go through the process. And that's one of the ideas that we'll kind of develop a little bit later, and maybe we'll talk about in the question and answer too, depending on what we get. So let's start to make some predictions, okay? What can we possibly predict would happen if you start to push sexuality and gender identity onto children who can't grasp abstract concepts, right? So what if you start talking to these young children about gender being a psychological choice and not a biological fact, right? So this video I'm going to show you right now is one of the first cases that went national. This was in 2017, and it was a case out of Rockland, California. It just so happened to be right next door to where we were living at the time. And I'll let the video play, and then I'll kind of give you a summary, but you can see what happened.
An emotional Rockland Academy teacher addressing a packed house of parents, many furious about her decision to discuss the topic of gender identity inside her kindergarten class.
It was never my intent to harm any students, only to support them through a difficult situation.
The teacher defended her actions to read 2 books she says were given to her by a transgender child going through a transition.
The kindergartners came home very confused about whether or not you can pick your gender, whether or not they really were a boy or a girl.
Parents say besides the books, the transgender student at some point during class also changed clothes and was revealed as her true gender. And many parents say they feel betrayed and blindsided.
I want her to hear from me as a parent what her gender identity means to her and to our family. Not from a book that may be controversial. My daughter went home crying, shaking, so afraid that she could turn into a boy.
The issue was not on the agenda, so parents spoke out during Monday night's public comment.
It's really about the parents being informed and involved and, giving us the choice and the rights about, what's getting introduced to our kids and at what age.
Okay, so what's getting introduced and at what age, right? That's what we're talking about. And the question is, could we have predicted some of this? I mean, when you think about the cognitive level of a 5-year-old and you think about the complexity of gender identity, I don't think it's too hard to predict some of the issues that might come from this. So one of the things you could predict is confusion, and confusion can lead to fear. And that's what we saw in this case. You had children running home, not understanding the complexity and the abstract nature of gender identity, and them thinking that they could spontaneously change sex. And it freaked them out and it scared them. Another thing that you have to understand, a potential pitfall of this, is that children at this age are pleasers to authority figures. So if you have a child that might be experiencing some gender dysphoria or just gender play that we don't even know is gender dysphoric, they're just engaging in gender play because they're fairly gender neutral, and they have somebody that is pushing a certain ideology, meaning you have maybe a teacher or a parent or authority figure that's saying, oh, you must be transgender, you should, transition, and they start pushing the transition. Well, how do you know it's not that child just trying to please the authority figure that they're connected to? At that age, children are pleasers. It would be very difficult to determine whether or not that child is really experiencing gender dysphoria or whether they're just trying to please that authority figure. Another possible thing is disassociation. Children, if they can't understand a complex concept, they might just disassociate. They'll just check out of the lesson of what's being taught. And the idea that bringing this down to a younger grade level will somehow build tolerance for future problems for transgender teens, for example. One of the ideas is if we create tolerance at a much younger age, then by the time these teens interact, there'll be more tolerance and you'll have less suicide and stuff like that. Well, what if by bringing this down at a younger age, the kids just disassociate to it and check out? And now you're not building tolerance, you're building indifference because the subject matter is too complex, right? So there's a whole host of potential problems or unintended consequences. And in this case, we actually saw those materialize right in front of our eyes. So this is not a new idea to question these types of issues. In other words, that's a picture of Piaget you're looking at. And Piaget, when he was going around and he was touring the world and he was talking about his various theories and what he was finding with his tests, one of the things that he ran into was this idea of pushing things down the development scale. So in other words, especially in America with our fast-paced assembly line type of culture, we wanted to basically say, hey, this is great. Kids develop at certain stages. How do we get them there faster? How can we push this? And Piaget ran into this question so many times in America that he actually labeled it the American question. And that's really what we're talking about right now. We're talking about taking something that would normally be in a later stage of development. It's Erickson's stage 5, identity versus confusion, which is 12 to 18 years old. That's when gender, identity, sexuality, puberty, all that stuff, that's when that all comes about. And so we're talking about taking a stage of development and we're talking about pushing it down to kindergarten level, all right? And so this is not a new concept. This was actually addressed when Piaget was studying all this. And like I said, in America is where he confronted this all the time. And he got so frustrated, he actually called it the American question. And he responded with a question of his own, which was simply, why would you want to do that, right? And in Piaget's thinking, he thought that the process of child development and the time that it takes for a child to develop was more important than the product. In other words, he felt that if you tried to push children too quickly through stages of development, you would sacrifice the process for the product. In other words, it would create a diminished result. And we see this, you can see how important stages of development are in cases where children were severely abused. For instance, if you have those cases where a child was neglected conversation and language, we know that there is a window where children really develop strong language. And so there's been these severe abuse cases where children were kept in closets and chained and kept without real human interaction and human dialogue, and they get rescued. Yes, you can reintroduce language and you can get some development in language, but those children will always suffer deficits because that window where language was important was lost. So one of the things Piaget would say is, if you're taking a period in time where children are supposed to be developing language or something else, and you're dumping sexuality or gender into that, then that's a recipe for disaster, right? So what are the law of unintended consequences? Or what is the law of unintended consequences? This idea is something that came out of sociology. It's taught in economics, and that's kind of what we're leading into. That was connected to Piaget's question, right? And that ties into what I talked about in the very beginning of having an open dialogue. So we're going to start to look at what are potential unintended consequences. What could result from that? And we're going to make some predictions. And this is where we're going to get a little dark and where I'm going to start to move into the molestation component. And before I do that, I just want to let everybody know that, a strong part of my background was teaching child safety. So I ran my own self-defense school for 18 years. We taught separate curriculum to children, separate curriculum to women, and separate curriculum to men, because violence is actually different. The types of threats that children face, they're different than what women face, and they're different than what men face. And so we had an entirely different curriculum. Our child curriculum was really heavy on child safety and teaching kids how to understand the tricks and the lures that predators use. So when we start to, go into this, I'm going to talk a lot about my experience working with trauma survivors, working with children that were molested. I've taught for LGBTQ groups. I've worked with survivors, LGBTQ I+, they're sexually assaulted at much higher rates. So I've had clients across all the spectrum, all right? So what are some of the unintended consequences? What predictions can we make, and what could go wrong with bringing this material down? So what are the normal sexual behaviors, right? And again, we're talking about bringing a stage of development down, right? So what are normal sexual behaviors? So for young children, touching, nakedness, they'll run around and toddlers will run around naked. You may have a hard time getting clothes on them. They'll try to peek at you in the shower. They'll play doctor. They'll try to kiss and hug. But the ultimate intention behind all this is fairly innocent. It's more just sexual exploration as opposed to sexual expression. There's no real intent behind it in terms of a sexual outcome. As children get older, as they go into adolescence, you start to see more formalized sexual behaviors. You start to see more formalized masturbation. You start to have kids having sexual dreams. Sexual arousal intensifies. They start to become attracted to whatever it is that their attraction is, and they start to pursue those attractions. Among Americans, 14 to 17 years old, among Americans 14 to 17 years old, once masturbation starts, they tend to seek out actual partners for sexuality. Okay. So the minute they start to engage in the formalized masturbation, then they're going to start to actually look to engage to involve sexual partners. So the question becomes, if you understand basic theories in psychology, right? And you understand that thinking and behavior are tied together, we call this the cognitive triangle. And this is one of the most successful forms of therapy in psychology, is called cognitive behavioral therapy. And this is where we understand the idea of how thoughts and feelings and behaviors interact. And the idea that if you can change the way somebody thinks about something, you can change the way they feel. So go back to the videos with my son. All right. We were able to change the way that he thought about this horrific experience of cancer. Cancer treatment, if you've ever been a part of it or had a family member in it and they've gone through anything extensive, it's a horrific process. But my son couldn't understand how serious it was. He was too young to understand the idea of life or death. So he's literally going off of what is directly happening. So we're literally changing the way he thinks about having needles stuck into him and having, his eye surgically removed. And we're changing the way that he feels, which changed his behavior. Okay. That idea is the same principle that will happen if you bring child sex ed and gender down to these younger levels. Meaning, if you add to the sophistication and the knowledge and the understanding of a kindergartner, of a first grader about sexuality, right? What would make you think that increase in knowledge and sophistication and thinking is not going to change the feelings or the behaviors of that child? That doesn't make any sense based on what I'm showing you right now in terms of how psychology works. And then the question becomes, well, can we think of an example that would prove that? Okay, and again, this is where things get a little dark. Why do you think child molesters, right prior to the molestation, okay, and this is a very personal topic to me because my mother was molested as a child, and that's really how I got involved in women's issues and doing all the sexual assault training. She was from Holland, and I saw her therapy process, and she was very open about it, and I saw the whole thing. I mean, 3 years of extensive therapy and some very serious psychological issues that she finally talked about and discussed, and it stemmed back to molestation when she was 5 or 6 years old. So I really understand how these issues can impact somebody all throughout their life. So why do you think a molester prior to molesting starts to desensitize a child to sexuality? Meaning a molester doesn't just jump into the actual physical touching and molestation. I'm going to go through the stages here in a second. But right prior to the molestation, they really start introducing sexual topics, sexual ideas, sexual thoughts, sexual imagery. They talk about animals having sex, so that, your pets and things like that. They might engage with the kid with toys and put the toys in sexual positions and things like that. All of this is to normalize the act so that when they start the molestation, the child is more susceptible to it and it becomes more normal to them, right? So this idea that you should bring sexuality and gender down to the kindergarten level to me, has some very severe unintended consequences, because you can't expect to change their thinking, to change their sophistication, to change their knowledge without changing their feelings and behavior. That is inconsistent with basic premises and theories in psychology. So what are the steps of grooming? Now, this is from RAINN, the nation's largest anti-sexual violence organization. And this is based on forensic profiling, right? Forensic psychology. So in forensic psychology, one of the things that we do is we study serial killers, and we study serial rapists, and we study child molesters, and we build profiles. And for the most part, the profiles are pretty accurate, and we do a good job. And in many cases, they actually help solve crimes. Sometimes we get it wrong. It's not an exact science, but it's a fairly good science. So when you study molesters, there's a process that they go through. And as I read through this, I want you to really think of this in terms of a school environment. Ask yourself, is a school environment consistent with all these things? Okay, so does a school environment give access for victim selection, where you can kind of get to know the students, get to know the kids that are having problems at home, things like that? Does it give teachers or anybody involved in the school environment access to build trust, to start to get the kids to keep secrets? Are there moments for isolation? And is there an ability to desensitize the kids to physical contact? Do you get to give them high fives, pat them on the head? If they fall down and get injured, do you get to cater to the injury? And then what we used to do is we used to stop at this last thing. It wasn't a part of education, especially young children's education, which is to have discussions related to sex. So if we bring sexuality and gender down to the kindergarten level, we have literally completed all of the stages for grooming. The entire process is now complete in the school system. And what that does is that exposes an entire generation, not just to any potential molester that's in the school system, but any molester at all. Because if you really look at the facts, most children are molested by people that they know close to them, in and within the home. Of course, there are problems with teachers, and we have even had priests and ministers, and we have coaches, and there's a whole list of people that molest, but primarily it does happen in and around the home. But the problem is what happens when the school system itself has done all the grooming, has done all the work for any molester that comes in contact with the child, right? So now when the molester is going through this grooming process and they start talking about sex, you're going to take away that innocence and that intuition that the child has, because it's going to be normalized. The kindergarten teacher talked about it, their first grade teacher talked about it, their second grade teacher talked about it. So now when the predator talks about it, it's normal, right? Now the question becomes, how safe is our school system? So now we're going to look just at the school system. Like I said, this is a problem in terms of any molester that the child comes in contact with, but the school system itself has a problem. So this was back in 2004. The US Department of Ed did a study, and they found that 1 in 10 students will experience school employee sexual misconduct by the time they graduate from high school. The bottom stat is from the CDC. About 1 in 4 girls and 1 in 6 boys in the United States will experience child sexual abuse by the age of 18. Now that's based on what we call retroactive studies. That's where you go and study, you go and do surveys of adults later when they're more comfortable talking about, child sexual abuse and things like that. And then they say, yes, I was abused. That's where we get that stat from. If you actually go on the CDC and you look at their stats from research, the 1 in 4 girls stays the same, but the 1 in 6 goes to 1 in 13 in terms of boys. Okay. So, and that's everything combined. That's not just, exposure to school molesters. That's just what we know in terms of children being exposed to molestation. All right. These are headlines. Okay. And what I'm just trying to show you is that this is a known problem. So in 2007, which was just after the time or during the time of the 2004 report, the Associated Press did a 7-month-long investigation looking at 5 years, and they found more than 2,500 cases where educators were punished for actions that were labeled bizarre to sadistic. Now, this is a headline from CBS. In 2015, I'm just showing you different sources. There's a group, which I encourage you to look at, called Sesame. It's a group dedicated to stopping educator abuse. They did their own review of arrest records and found just under 500 educators were arrested on incidents of sexual abuse in schools. And right now, Fox News Digital is tracking stories this year. And last I checked, which was right before this presentation, they are now up to 269 K through 12 educators arrested on child sex crimes in the first 9 months of the year. Now, when we get to the next slide, it's going to help you kind of understand where we get into these 1 in 4 and 1 in 6 or 1 in 13 numbers, because we're just talking about cases right now in the school system. We're not talking about all of the other potential molestation cases that are taking place in and around the home, et cetera. And here we only looked at, roughly a 6-year window going back to 2004. So out of 22 years, we're looking at 6 years, and we have over 3,000 cases. Now, when you compare that with this next slide, you start to see the problem. So this was a 2010 Government Office of Accountability report. And when they crunch out the offender numbers, you can have one teacher offender can have as many as 73 victims. Okay. Now, one of the reasons for this is because one of the last tools in the child molester toolbox that most people don't understand is that when you introduce a child, like the way that these molesters do, to sexuality at a young age, and the children cognitively don't understand all of the abstract dynamics of sexuality because they're too young, as we've already talked about, right? That child, though, remembers the sexuality, they remember the sexual molestation. And now as they get post-puberty, as they start to actually develop these more adult concepts of sexuality, as they start to talk to their peers, as they start to understand what love and what intimacy and what sexuality actually is, shame is the last tool in the toolbox of the child molester, shame and guilt. And it's shame and guilt that keeps children silent. They don't want to talk about it because now they understand that this wasn't normal sexuality, that this behavior wasn't something that was supposed to happen to them, right? And that's why you end up with child molesters being able to accumulate all of these victims, and they just keep going on from one to another as they stay silent. All right. So go back and start thinking about, well, if one teacher can have as many as 73 victims, and in a 6-year window, we had over 3,000 cases. Remember, we started this with the idea of how safe are your children in our public schools? How good are the public schools at vetting out pedophiles? And I'm by no means saying that our school system, that all the teachers out there are pedophiles and they're molesting children. It's exactly the opposite. I am saying that when you have a situation where one teacher can have as many as 73 victims, we need to take a very hard, serious approach at the hiring and the vetting practices to deal with this, because it doesn't take a lot of molesters in the system to create a lot of victims. Okay. So intuition comes from innocence. All right. When you teach child safety, one of the things that you do is you teach children the difference between secrets and surprises. And just to show you that this isn't something that I came up with, I just put a quote up there from an actual site that deals with, adult child abuse survivors. And this is right off their website for something that you should be talking to your children about. This is common in child safety theory. Child safety educators, we all teach this idea of having children understand that surprises are good because you end up knowing what's going on. Secrets are bad. And earlier I talked about intuition a little bit when I was talking about the grooming cycle. The problem with bringing sexuality and gender down to the kindergarten through, I would argue 4th grade level. So when DeSantis banned this material in kindergarten through 3rd grade, academically, it was a sound argument to ban that material. I would actually argue that it's academically sound in kindergarten through 4th grade, because Erickson's stage 5 kicks in 5th grade. But the point I'm getting at is that what is the best weapon for a child when they're 5 years old for their safety is their intuition. Again, I taught self-defense for 18 years. I ran a school. And the reality is a 5-year-old can't defend themselves against an adult physically. If an adult's going to violently grab them, pick them up, carrying them off, this is not, Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles or something that you can't, a 5-year-old's not going to win that fight. Luckily, that doesn't happen very often. Typically, molestation is done by coercion. There's no force or violence there. It's trickery, it's deception. So intuition is your child's best weapon, and intuition comes from innocence. When that child molester starts to get to the process of grooming, where they start talking about sexuality and they start talking about sex acts and doing things with their body parts that nobody else is talking to them about, it triggers the child's intuition. It causes the kid to go, whoa, this is weird. Why are you talking to me about this? Nobody else talks to me about this, right? The problem with bringing sexuality education down to this age group is that you're going to steal their innocence. And when you steal their innocence, their intuition is going to go with it. So now when that pedophile or child molester is grooming the child and they start talking about sexuality, it's going to be normal to the child because their kindergarten teacher talked to them about it. Their 1st grade teacher talked to them about it. Their 2nd grade teacher talked to them about it. And the predator is talking to them about it. So there's not going to be that intuition signal that kicks off. They're not going to get that feeling in the pit of their stomach that says something's wrong, I need to run away. That's the problem from a child safety standpoint with bringing this material down. That's a potential unintended consequence that nobody is thinking about it. I recognize it because it's my field of study and it's something that I've done as a child safety educator. What about for parents? What's this going to do for parents? Well, as a parent, how do you recognize? So one of the other things I used to do is I used to talk to parents and teach them how to look for abuse. How do you recognize if your child is being groomed, right? So there are physical and emotional signs of abuse that get talked about a lot. The emotional signs of abuse, though, usually come after the abuse. Physical signs as well typically come after the abuse. So a physical sign of abuse might be a child that is now all of a sudden having trouble holding their bladder because they've been sodomized, and so now there's damage there. And that's a physical sign of abuse that you would find in a forensic evaluation after the fact. But the behavioral signs of abuse you can catch during the grooming process, and that's why they're so important. Okay, so what are the behavioral signs of abuse that we look for? Well, one of the things you're going to look for is you're going to look for excessive talk, knowledge, sophistication, understanding about sexuality, about sexual behaviors. So when your 5-year-old is demonstrating or talking, demonstrating sophistication or talking a lot or showing knowledge or behaviors or mannerisms about sexuality that they shouldn't have, it cues you in as a parent to start investigating. If they're demonstrating sexual behavior that's inappropriate for their age, it causes you to investigate, or you should. That's what we teach you to do, is go, hey, where did you learn that? Who told you that? And that starts the process of then trying to break down the secrets that the molester would have already put in place, right? Because the molester is going to be telling the child now, don't talk to this about your mom. This is our secret that we're talking about this, that I'm showing you these pictures or whatever. But children, the younger they are, the poorer they are at keeping secrets. So typically, if you can open the dialogue, if you can pick up on the behavior, the secrets will fall down. Well, if we normalize this in the school system, okay, if the child comes home from kindergarten and they are showing sexual sophistication and knowledge and understanding about sexual topics, and the behavior has followed, like we've already talked about, well, now you've robbed from parents that indicator, that sign that something is wrong, because you ask them, where are you learning this? And the kid says kindergarten, my kindergarten teacher, my first grade teacher, and that's just something we come to expect because we're going to teach kids this, right? So it can hide the grooming activity from parents, and it can steal from kids their best safety mechanism. So what are our conclusions? What have we kind of brought about through this discussion? Is that first, if you bring sexuality and gender identity down to the kindergarten, through third, fourth grade level, you are going to increase their understanding. You're going to increase their knowledge. You're going to increase their sophistication. You have to assume that you are also going to increase age and appropriate sexual behavior, that the behavior and the feelings is going to follow the thinking and the knowledge. Assuming otherwise is to turn your back on the very process that molesters use to molest. That is why they go through those steps of molestation, and right prior to the physical contact, they focus on increasing the knowledge, sophistication, understanding of sexual behavior. Okay. Grooming strategies that are used by molesters are now going to be normalized and just considered education. And this is going to expose children to any molester that they could come in contact with. It is going to deny children their innocence, which is going to deny them their strongest safety measure against the grooming process, which is their own intuition. As much as we try as parents and guardians and caregivers to keep our children safe, it is difficult to always watch them every single step of the way. And that's why child safety is so important. And lastly, parents are going to lose invaluable signals of potential grooming so that they can intervene and potentially protect their children and prevent a molestation. So at this point, I think we're going to turn it back to Pam. Thank you everybody for listening, and I'm going to stop sharing my screen so that we could take questions.
Great. Thank you, Conrad. I do see questions piling up, and I'd like to introduce Mia Benedict. She's co-founder of Pushback Idaho and my partner in change. She's going to conduct the Q&A, and we're going to get answers to your questions. Over to you, Mia.
Great, thanks, Pam. Conrad, I have a question. What types of behavior are defined as sexual misconduct regarding the slide that references school employees' misconduct?
Yeah, so there is a broad list of categories for sexual misconduct that can range from everything from harassing, inappropriate text messages, emails, contact personally, all the way to actual inappropriate physical contact. So they lumped a whole category of stuff together. And unfortunately, the Department of Ed has been resistant to conduct further studies related to this topic. We really need more research done, but they haven't done it for the most part.
Is the Department of Ed where that research would take place typically?
Well, ideally, yes, because it's really hard to get independent research done into a K through 12 school system like that. You'd have to have approvals, and so ideally they should be doing it themselves, but they're not.
Okay, thank you. I have another question from Lisa. Do you see the media making this newsworthy?
Making which specifically?
I believe just the subject of that you're speaking of, any of those particular points about sexuality in school, any of these things. Do you see it?
Most of what's been covered with grooming related to this, which is why I kind of opened the way I did, is related to political ideology. And if anything, this last election showed us is that this country is very divided. And that's why I started with the stories that I did on history, because what we really need to do is just have open, honest conversations and share ideas without pigeonholing each other. So if you question this the way I'm questioning right now, I'm just presenting information and material, then one approach would be to automatically say, well, you're just anti-trans, Okay. And then the opposite side is if you're on the right and you're looking at this, you're saying, well, you guys are socialist over there, and that's why you're pushing all this. And so when you deal with grooming in terms of political ideology, it just really divides us and we don't get anywhere. And then we don't get to look at the unintended consequences. So my goal is to try to bring a dialogue back, get people to have a conversation so that we can really start to look at these unintended consequences that aren't being discussed. Do I think it's newsworthy? Absolutely. I mean, but we're a reactive society. One of the things that will probably get more news on this is that if we actually start getting more support for the millions of victims out there, if you take 1 in 10 kids in a system that has 54 million kids in K through 12, 1 in 10 is a large number. So if we started to get some class action lawsuits going, I think you would start to see some change and more attention to it.
Okay, thank you. Katie asks, why is sex ed part of a school's curriculum? Should it be? How did it come to be?
Well, there's a lot of history there that goes into that. That would be kind of a presentation in and of itself. But just understand that we as parents have kind of given up a lot of the moral education of our children. The schools have slowly taken that over. And I do believe that is a whole nother dialogue that needs to be had, is whether or not the school system is the best place to have that conversation, or whether or not our parents are now more equipped, or our churches or other places are more equipped to have these conversations. If you go back 50, 60, 70 years, people didn't talk about sex and sexuality with their kids. One of the major turning points was HIV. It was the AIDS epidemic in the 80s. For those of us that lived through that, I happened to be in high school during the AIDS epidemic. And I remember when we thought you could get it from mosquitoes and from saliva. And I mean, when Rock Hudson passed away, it created a huge fear about sexuality. And that actually is what started a lot of the schools and the parents and everybody giving leeway and saying, yes, educate, do everything you can, because everybody was scared their kids were going to die. Because we knew, that high rates of teens experiment sexually, whether you want to admit it or not. And we teach chastity and abstinence and all these good things. I mean, that they're all great, but the reality is, statistically speaking, teenagers are engaging in sexual activity in high rates in this country. Right. So you have to dive deep into history, and there were major events like the AIDS epidemic that led to that. But I absolutely believe that this is a whole nother debate and question as to whether the schools should even be doing this. I don't know that they should, but that's a whole nother presentation, really.
I bet on that. I just got a whole slew of questions, and I'm hoping, Pam, we still have some time. I know some people will have to get off, but I think a lot of people would like some of these answered.
Let's stay on it.
Okay. Do you think that sexualizing young children has to do with abortion and development of a different identity? And I think they're talking politically.
Do I?
Is it a development of a leftist identity, I think is the question they're asking.
Well, again, we get we get into these political divides. So yes and no, meaning, let me take you back to my analogy to try to answer that. When all of those doctors who didn't want to take the time to wash their hands in the late 1800s and who were killing an astronomical number of women, do I think that all those doctors had the intent to kill the women? No, I think that they just didn't realize that washing their hands and cleaning their instrument was the solution, right? So now, are there some medical staff and medical doctors and nurses that have been serial killers and things like, well, yeah, you don't. So there are evil intent within any ideology, right? So within the left, you have the far left, and within the right, you have the far right, and there can be violence and there can be evil intent on either side. So when you start getting into that, I don't like to just label one side or the other. How many teachers out there? How many people are teaching stuff without any evil intent? They think what they're doing is best, but they don't have the education, they don't have the experience, and we're not having enough dialogue to really make them think, well, wait a minute, yeah, this doesn't sound good for child safety, this doesn't sound good for child development. So I mean, it's a yes and no kind of answer. Of course, there's people that are driving agendas on all sides, and they have evil intent, right? But there's also a lot of people that just don't fully understand the unintended consequences. And the more divided we are, right, the more we pigeonhole each other and we don't listen to ideas from each side, the more unintended consequences we are going to suffer, because it's that diversity of thought. It's listening to each other on who have different opinions that actually helps expose us to those potential unintended consequences. If we close ourselves off to the opposing ideologies, we are going to have more severe unintended consequences. And that's what history has showed us.
And less critical thinking then.
Right.
That. Okay. Another good question. I've heard that many, this anonymous, I have heard that many students online during the pandemic were exposed to sexually inappropriate content at alarming levels. Is there concrete evidence of this? I've just been told this without evidence.
Yeah, I'm not, I mean, I don't like to answer to anything I'm not privy to myself either.
Yeah.
So I personally have not investigated that particular issue. So, and I'm not the type of person that just hypothesize.
No problem.
Yeah.
I have a great question here from a parent. Do you have any tips for parents regarding how to have conversations with our young children about possible inappropriate interactions with educators without us being the ones to introduce sexuality too early? Great question.
Yeah, so there's a lot of great resources for child safety. And I mean, again, this would be a whole nother presentation, but let me just direct you to a site. And I'm not connected to this site, but I used to use it in my self-defense curriculum. And it has a lot of curriculum educational material. It talks about not keeping secrets, and it's called the Yellow Dino curriculum for child safety. They have songs and videos, and basically they teach, or they help parents teach young children what are the typical lures that child molesters use to gain trust and to trick their children. So that would be my best advice without having to actually go into a whole nother webinar on child safety. Okay, is just go to that website as a parent and look at that material, show your kids some of the videos, and that will help open that dialogue for you if you yourself aren't comfortable or don't have the background to do it. Okay.
Great. I'm going to give you, I've got a couple other questions.
Sure.
This particular one from Stephanie. I'm a retired high school teacher and administrator. Looking back, I see the same kind of grooming techniques were sadly happening to teenagers. And yet today's conventional wisdoms thinks that the adolescent is age appropriate. I would even argue against that. What are your thoughts on that, Conrad?
Yeah, so most of the time, I mean, the ages for molestation actually are in those early teen years. So that's absolutely true. We do tend to talk about, child molestation, and we think about it as young children, but statistics are absolutely in those early teens. As a matter of fact, you are, when it comes to sexual violence, you are almost four times more likely to be sexually assaulted between the ages of 16 and 19 than at any time in your life. I have some ideas on sex ed, and how we should kind of redo or revamp some of those ideas that should be built more on safety, starting to teach, basic some self-defense concepts and safety concepts and things like that, that I think would be beneficial as opposed to what we actually currently do. But yeah, I don't disagree. I mean, like I said in the beginning, this is a very difficult, complex topic, and we're asking teachers who typically have liberal arts degrees that then go into a credentialing program. And unless you got your degree in child development or specialized or took a lot of extra child development classes and psychology classes, most teachers, believe it or not, they don't necessarily have a lot of actual child development coursework. A lot of people don't realize that, but it's true. They may not have a lot of actual child development and child psychology coursework in their liberal arts background. Some teachers focus in on it, but they may only have a handful of classes.
Great. Thank you very much. Pam, I'm going to turn this back over to you. Thank you so much, Conrad, for answering these questions.
Sure.
Thanks, Mia. If you'd like more information regarding Conrad's affiliation with Parents' Rights in Education, Pushback Idaho will be doing a follow-up communication with how best to contact him. This has been pretty intense material. We think it's been important to share. We look forward to your comments through our Contact Us button at pushbackidaho.org. Thanks, everybody. Good night.